But so you take two of your things, you're going to ask yourself these 5 questions. The answers to these questions should help you reveal to yourself, oh, this is clearly the bigger priority. So here are the questions. So the first one is, if both of these things were immediately accomplished magically overnight, which would have a bigger impact on my overall goal? For example, if you were like, let's say I doubled my Twitter audience or doubled my podcast listening. If that could happen magically overnight, which would have a bigger impact on my goal? The one that has a bigger impact, which should theoretically be the bigger priority. Again, it's hypothetical, but helpful. I'm a big believer in assuming success. So this is an example of sort of assuming success. The second question is, if both of these things were immediately accomplished, which would I be happier to have done? So there is a piece of this that is what actually gives you joy and what, would you be happier to double your Twitter audience or to double your podcast downloads? Something to consider. So again, whichever that answer is another strike in the column for that one being a bigger priority. The third question is, if you had to eliminate one of the two things completely and never do it at all, which would you eliminate? So if you were forced to either say, I'm never going to use Twitter again, or I'm never going to do a podcast again, which would you choose and why? Again, this is getting to, like, on some level, these are all tricks to get inside your mind and figure out what feels more important to you. The fourth question is, if you had to outsource one of these things, which would you outsource and why? If you had to say, you know what, I'm going to let someone else run my Twitter, I'm going to let someone else run my podcast. Again, if you had to do it, which would you choose? And that question can also help you surface, that ties back into some of the efficiency, because you might not fully outsource it, but you might go, you know what? I spend a lot of time editing that podcast. Maybe it does make sense to have somebody edit it for me, that kind of thing. And then the last of the questions to figure out your priority between two things is, if you had to pause or postpone one of these things, one of these goals by 6 months, which would you postpone? That helps you get at the immediacy that, does it matter if you were like, you know what, I'm going to focus on the podcast for 6 months and I'm not going to use Twitter. What's the impact of that? Or I'm going to use Twitter for 6 months and the podcast is going to go on hiatus for 6 months. What's the impact of that? With those 5 questions, even if it's close, at least 3 of those answers are going to go one direction and 2 is going to go the other. So it's a way to get out of your own head and kind of go, oh, well, I just told myself what the priority is. This is more important than the other based on sort of this series of questions. Again, you can do that repeatedly. So you might do that between your Twitter and your podcast. And then you might go, okay, well, clearly Twitter is the bigger priority. But then you might go, okay, I'm going to do Twitter versus coaching calls. And you might go, oh, coaching calls is actually more important. So you can wind up with this sort of ranked list and then look at the time and effort you're doing and adjust accordingly.